Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about Donald Trump's ADHD throwing cold water on the Goldwater rule. So I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. I actually have an hour's worth of information to present here. So if any of you have a group or an occasion where you'd like me to do a longer presentation about this, I'm happy to do so. Additional information on this topic is in my book, Recognizing Adult ADHD, and on my medium.com blog post where I've talked about this topic as well. So today I'm going to be, again, trying to rush a lot of information into a short space of time. I'm going to be talking about what the Goldwater rule is and how it came to be, why I staunchly believe that Donald Trump's ADHD throws cold water on this rule, and where we might go in terms of ethics regarding talking about the mental health of public officials. So to throw it in quickly at the front, the Goldwater rule is an ethical rule in the American Psychiatric Association's Code of Ethics for Psychiatrists. It is not a law, and it states in summary that without an in-person evaluation and without that individual's consent, a psychiatrist should not be talking publicly about a public figure's mental health. So again, this is not a law, but when we say it's just an ethical rule, doesn't mean it has no teeth. So for example, in California and most other states, if an individual doctor violates their specialty's code of ethics, that can be sufficient grounds for taking away their license. But again, I'll be talking about why I think this is an outdated and obsolete ethical rule. So the Goldwater rule is named after Barry Goldwater, the presidential candidate in 1964, running against Lyndon Johnson. He was the first, in the modern era anyway, major party candidate coming from the extremist wing of his party. So he was an extreme conservative, which he was proud of. Because of his less than mainstream stance, many people were worried about the stability of him as a leader. Notoriously, LBJ ran commercials of nuclear clouds blowing up, as suggesting that this guy was so unstable he was going to blow up our world. And there was a startup, muckraking, controversial publication called Fact Magazine, interesting in our day of alternative facts. And Fact Magazine sent out a survey to all 10,000 plus members of the American Psychiatric Association, asking them whether they believed Barry Goldwater was stable enough to become president of the United States. Only about, and I'm rounding numbers here, only about 2,000, so less than a fifth of psychiatrists bothered to respond to that survey. Among those who responded, the split was amazingly even. Half of them said, he seemed competent, but the other half said he was not competent to be president. So that got, highlighted as 1,000 psychiatrists say he's incompetent. And worse than just the vote on this issue was the commentary, the spontaneous comments that many of the psychiatrists submitted with their surveys, saying that Goldwater was a megalomaniac, that he was a latent schizophrenic, that he was a closet homosexual, all which would be reasons not to be president. And Barry Goldwater actually sued Fact Magazine. He did not sue the psychiatrists, but he did sue Fact Magazine. The rulings were appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Barry Goldwater, many years later, did win in the Supreme Court for libel, that these findings were libelous and inappropriate. Now, clearly there were ethical issues involved in this, but there was also a big embarrassment to psychiatry. It was embarrassing that so many psychiatrists were putting their personal views, couching them in scientific or psychiatric framework, and to sort of restore or maintain what aspects of its reputation it had. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association again included what's called the Goldwater Rule in its Code of Ethics. And again, I'll repeat it. It's that without an in-person evaluation and without the consent of that individual, psychiatrists can't be publicly talking about mental health of a public figure. So many discussions of this rule, Goldwater rule, are framed about confidentiality. What I'm going to be talking about today and what most people's discussions around this center around people who are doing armchair diagnoses or have not had an in-person evaluation. And if you are just gleaning information from the public domain, the whole issue of confidentiality is taken off the table because you're using public information. You're not using confidential information. So you can't possibly violate confidentiality. There is a related issue there, and some in organized psychiatry have claimed that if Dr. Kruse or Dr. Bandy Lee at Yale is talking about Trump's mental health, people will get the idea that anything they say to their psychiatrist could be spouted out on blogs or posts or national TV. I believe most people are sophisticated and intelligent enough to make the distinction that there's a difference between me talking about Donald Trump based on information on the public domain versus the rule, which I definitely should be in place, that I will not be talking about my own individual patients unless they're asking to me to do so, and that there's a very good reason to be doing so. The second big topic or ethical issue that comes up around the Goldwater rule is that if someone's causing a harm to others, and this is the premise of a book called A Dangerous Case, which Dr. Bandy Lee, again, a Yale psychiatrist, and about 24 other mental health professionals put this out very soon after Trump got into office. And the claim is Trump is so dangerous, he's so harmful to the country that we have a duty to warn others. We have a duty to violate confidentiality. Again, confidentiality isn't even in play here, but we have a duty to warn others. And in all of our states at the federal level and in many jurisdictions, there are specific laws saying if a psychiatrist does have specific imminent knowledge that someone is going to harm others or even harm themselves and aren't willing to follow rules or guidance that we think may eliminate that risk, then the psychiatrist or other mental health professional has an obligation to warn others to prevent them from harm to themselves. But this is not just a blanket rule. So if I have a patient, for example, who says, God, I hate Trump, I'd like to go kill him, that does not give me ethical or legal right to turn that person over to the Secret Service or FBI. If, however, they are saying, I really despise Trump, I've bought a AK-57, I've bought my Greyhound ticket to go to Washington, D.C. next week, I know he's going to be in town and giving a speech then, and I have a chance of picking him off. If there is detailed, specific evidence of an imminent threat, yes, then I have an issue or reason to violate confidentiality. Whether Donald Trump's behavior reaches the level of imminent threat, I am somewhat dubious of that. And the interesting thing about the dangerous case of Donald Trump and the numerous essays or chapters in that book is most of the authors took great care to follow the letter of the Goldwater rule. So most of them avoided making any specific diagnosis, but I think they were actually directly violating the sense or intent of the Goldwater rule, because what they were saying is, he's bad, he's dangerous, he's bad, he's dangerous, we're experts, trust us, we know he's bad and dangerous. I'm in favor of the opposite approach, that if you think he's bad and dangerous, then you should be offering very specific diagnostic information, the criteria you use for that, and both the criteria for the diagnosis and the evidence you are using to support that diagnosis. So that's what I'm getting into. And that gets into a third, and I think the underlying ethical issue of the Goldwater rule is the ethical concept of veracity. Veracity means truthfulness. As psychiatrists or doctors, our job is to always be truthful. And the truthfulness element of the Goldwater rule is embedded in the claim that the in-person evaluation is the best, the most truthful, real way to come to a psychiatric diagnosis. I think that's a general interesting idea. I think it may well have had some validity 50, 60 years ago when the Goldwater rule was being formulated. But it's a pretty weak claim to base an ethical rule on. And why I say that is, even when we have two experts evaluating the same person using, again, the same formal DSM criteria, And there's overlap or consensus, but it's certainly not unanimity. We know that if they follow a very specific sort of manualized descriptive interview rather than just asking what they want to interview, they're more likely to get consensus, but there is no perfect consensus in the in-person evaluation. And I am arguing that there is a confluence of two special factors here with Donald Trump and ADHD that render the in-person evaluation not even a particularly good or useful diagnostic tool. So I'm arguing with ADHD, and there's a whole Facebook Live, I've done this on this a few weeks back. The diagnostic criteria are entirely observable behaviors. There are inattentive behaviors, there are impulsive behaviors, there are hyperactive behaviors. We do not need to know what he's thinking inside, what he's feeling inside. We do not need to know the motivation for any of these behaviors. We just need to know that in a pervasive way, he's more restless than others, that he interrupts others more often, that he impulsively makes comments. That fulfills the criteria for the diagnosis. And so what I'm saying, that so one of the specific factors that make it okay to violate the Goldwater rule here is that ADHD diagnosis does not rely on us knowing what's inside this man's head. They require us knowing whether his patterns of behavior conform to these criteria or not. And the second factor is, for Donald Trump and maybe a handful of other prominent people, we have vastly more behavioral data recorded in videotapes going back years than you could ever obtain in a few hours of an in-person evaluation. So if we have more relevant data by orders of magnitude in the public domain, you cannot make a plausible claim that an in-person evaluation is better. So I'm going to go into a few more details. So the data from the public domain isn't just more numerous by orders of magnitude. One, it goes over a longer period of time. If you're interviewing someone in person, you may see them over the course of a few weeks before you're required to make a diagnosis. With what we have on Mr. Trump, we have years full of data. So we can see the progression, we can see longitudinal things, patterns, which is actually required for the ADD diagnosis. Usually what we're doing in person is we are making inferences. We are assuming either the behaviors we're seeing displayed or the person's own description of how they behaved is accurate. Again, with Donald Trump in the public domain of videotape, we are not making inferences. We can see the data. That's way more powerful. We are being more close to the truth than an in-person evaluation. So two, it's not just the longitudinalness, it's also we get to see him in different settings. If you're evaluating someone, you're seeing them in your office for a set period of time. With Donald Trump, we have him giving speeches across the country. We've had tapes of him when he didn't know he was being evaluated. We have him in a variety of different settings. That's a much richer source of information than you could possibly get in an in-person evaluation. Three, we have more corroboratory sources available. Usually if a patient comes in, particularly an adult, we don't have what their parents thought of them, we don't have what their school thinks of them, we don't have what their coworkers think of them. I mean, sometimes we can obtain parts of that, but with Donald Trump, we have commentary from dozens of people. I mean, there's scores of books now of people who worked in his administration or reporters who have observed him over periods of times and interacted directly with him. We have accounts of family members who've written about him. We have much more corroborative third-party sources of information than we're ever going to get for an in-person interview for anybody. And the fourth aspect, or fifth, or I don't know how you're parsing them, when someone comes in for an interview, particularly if Donald Trump actually did come into your office, he's going to want to portray a certain image, control the interview, give you the perceptions or images he wants to convey to you. Again, the advantage of this vast collection of information on film is we have it in a variety of settings. He's not trying to appeal to us to shape our views of what we think is going on mental health-wise. And for that reason, we have a much more candid, valid source of information for making a diagnosis. So are there any ways this cornucopia of evidence in the public domain is lacking compared to an in-person interview. And yes, the answer is we do not have the ability to ask direct, pointed follow-up questions like, what were you thinking when this happened? Or, just why I would argue that is a very minor to trivial aspect for diagnosing ADHD and may be more important for other diagnoses. One is that, and this always sounds a little pejorative, it's objectively measurably so. We know the very processes that lead to impairments with attention, concentration, focus, staying on track, that people with ADHD have, these executive function deficits, measurably make them less aware, poorer observers of their own behavior. So people often don't know that they're talking much louder when they have ADHD. They may not be aware of how often they're interrupting others. They may not be aware that they're drumming on their desk with their fingers until people are telling them to stop. So there's a whole host of information that someone may be reporting about their own ADHD may not be particularly valid or useful. And that includes particularly historical data. I mean, one of the most interesting studies, and I don't have the specific numbers, but in New Zealand, they've done groundbreaking work for decades on longitudinally following kids from childhood in detailed ways up to adulthood. And there was a cohort of kids with ADHD studied into adulthood when these individuals who not only had ADHD as kids, who not only had ADHD diagnosed as kids, but were involved in research studies, something like at least a third of them as adults completely denied that they had ever had ADHD or was diagnosed before the present time. I mean, maybe some of them were intentionally deceiving because they were ashamed of it. Pretty clearly, it's more that they forgot, didn't process, weren't paying attention when the question was asked. But again, the veracity of information obtained on someone with ADHD is just inferior to what we would get from looking at the data there. So again, I argue we have the information, we have the criteria which rely only on behavioral information. We can make a valid ADHD diagnosis for Donald Trump. He clearly, he only needed 5 of those criteria, behavioral criteria, to come up with a diagnosis. He undeniably, unquestionably meets more than a dozen of them, and probably closer to 17 or 18 of the 18 criteria. He has the condition. Again, whether he has other additional conditions, possibly. Why this argument is valid, though, or more important beyond just Donald Trump and ADHD in the year 2020, is that, and part of the reason the ADD definition, which is not an optimal definition, but it's an adequate definition, was written this way, is psychiatry's goal for years, its holy grail, has been to find objective measures of ADHD, to find a blood test for depression, to find a brain scan for Alzheimer's, dementia, or schizophrenia. And although we're not there yet, we are getting closer and closer to genetic markers, brain activity markers, and there's a whole body of data. I mean, Google and Facebook and others may beat us to it because the vast information technologies are gathering huge amounts of information on the decisions you're making, the speed at which you're making decisions, the choices in words and searches and patterns. There's already studies showing we can predict suicidality, we can predict changes in baseline mood into depressed states from how people are behaving online, and that data is being recorded. I think in the next few years, we will have a number of ways of diagnosing a number of mental health conditions that are more accurate than an in-person evaluation by an expert, which means that the veracity claim which underpins the Goldwater rule is out the window if we can be more certain of a diagnosis made from how you are interacting on social media than sitting down for 3 hours with an expert. Then the Goldwater rule as it's written has no standing or viability or meaning. Because again, we will be able to make, and in a few cases right now, we can already make a more accurate diagnosis from available information rather than from an in-person evaluation. So that's why this is such a big issue, I would say, going forward. I think part of what we need to do is when we do make diagnoses of public figures, we should be very, very clear and explicit what are the diagnostic criteria we're using. We should be very careful about also delineating what data we are using. Again, the transparency, so others can examine and look at what we did, how we decided, and whether they actually disagree or not. That's what I've tried to do in my book, Recognizing Adult ADHD. Some of this is related to the issue of whether we should be screening or vetting our candidates for higher office. I am actually a strong proponent. I know there are civil libertarians and others who think we shouldn't, but the way I frame it is to be a recruit in the US military, you are vetted extensively for physical conditions and mental health conditions, and more than 60 different conditions. You're just not allowed to be a soldier. And yet, to be commander-in-chief of our army, we have absolutely no such criteria. There seems to be something wrong with that picture to me. Anyway, my 20 minutes are up today. Again, I can talk for more than an hour in more detail on some aspects of this and would be happy to do so. I'm also happy to answer any questions coming in right now. I will stall for another minute, and if no questions are there, then I'll sign off. If you have questions, I can be talking for another 20, 30 minutes answering them today. So the topic for next week is also a loaded issue. It's Donald Trump knows best. So it's about the evidence we have that he is using stimulant medication to address his ADD issues while in the White House. That'll be next week, same time, Friday at 11. And we are currently working on moving. These will still be available on Facebook, as Facebook Live under Dr. John Kruse. We are also moving them over to YouTube, and probably in the next week or two, they will be therefore available to a wider audience, including people who don't want to be part of the Facebook community. So I'm not seeing any questions right now, so I will be signing off for the week. Stay safe and sane, and take care of yourself and your loved ones. Bye for now.